Hello, everyone. We will be getting started shortly, and we are very excited to be here today to talk to you about this very important topic, how to best do trauma-informed interviewing and create a safe space and build trust with your client while developing their legal case. My name is Heather Hyman. I am the Human Trafficking Prevention Project Manager at Maryland Volunteer Lawyer Service, and I am here with my colleague, Jessica Emerson, the Director of the Human Trafficking Prevention Project at University of Baltimore, Maryland. And like I said, we are very excited to have you with us today. This is part of a quarterly free webinar series hosted by the HTPP. We've covered numerous topics in the past and are excited to be featuring this one for this quarter's entry into our library. If you're unable to make the whole webinar today, we will have this available on our website. Links to that will be at the end of the presentation. And we will also be sending out slides and a link to the recording of the webinar at the end.
We giving it a few minutes or should we get going?
I think we should dive in. It's 12:01, so
okay. It's 12:01. People are late. No, I'm just kidding.
we have a history of going over our allotted time, and there's a lot of things we want to talk about. So I think we'll just dive right in.
This is true. Okay, hold on one second.
And before we begin, just a few notes. This webinar is being recorded, just so everyone is aware of that. And we do want to try to make this as interactive as possible. We want to hear your thoughts on this important topic as well as we go through these different slides. So please feel free to chime in the chat, probably preferably in the chat as opposed to the question and answers. It's easier to just monitor one thing. But like I said, I think we're going to dive right in. We've already introduced ourselves. And so I'm going to hand it over to Jess to start talking. She's going to provide a little bit of an overview, a brief introduction to trauma.
Basic.
And then we're going to switch though to the meat of the presentation and really dive into techniques you can use to make sure that you are supporting your clients, preparing them, reacting in the best way possible to help them with their legal case and to help them tell their story.
Yes, excellent. All right, thank you, Heather. I just want to start by saying first, again, we are so thankful for all of you who could join us. I know you hear the term trauma informed all the time, but I find that there aren't, in my opinion, there aren't enough presentations that really focus on those trauma-informed techniques that you can take, that you can learn, and that you can take with you in terms of working with your clients. So we really are going to get much more into that today. Anyone who has seen me do kind of my complete trauma 101, we're going to have way less on the front end and way more on the back end. I'd also like to embarrass Heather by telling everyone that it's Heather's birthday today. So we'll wish her a happy birthday, and I'm sure she's so excited to be talking about trauma on her birthday.
Wouldn't be anywhere else.
Wouldn't be anywhere else. All right. So I want to start by asking the participants, if you had to define the term trauma, what does that actually mean? Because again, we hear that all the time. What does that mean? Hello, Layla. Hello.
Yeah, feel free to put things.
Yes, can drop it into the chat what you think the word trauma means. And again, we're not going to stay too much on this. We're really going to go into the interviewing techniques. Nobody would define it?
Let me just have a quiet group today.
No one at all. All right, that's fine. Oh, wait, did we get one? Mm-hmm. Abuse. Okay. All right. Any others? Abuse of some kind, right? What about the impact of that abuse, Layla? Emotional response to a terrible event. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Depression. Mm-hmm. Can be traumatic. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. All right. So we're going to take you through a couple of definitions because there are a couple. And the first, if you've ever watched any kind of medical drama, I just watched Chicago Med last night, and they talked about someone having trauma to some part of their body. when you use the term trauma in the medical setting, trauma to the abdomen, my joke is always, it doesn't mean your abdomen had a bad breakup. It legitimately means, in medical terms, a serious injury or shock to the body as from violence or an accident. But what we're going to focus on, and what I think our participants focused on, were the second two. So an emotional wound or shock that creates substantial lasting damage to psychological development, or a larger event or situation that causes great distress and disruption. I don't know, Heather, have we been living through a traumatic event the last 2.5 years?
Yeah, I think all of us, unfortunately, have experienced various levels of trauma related to events like COVID, like other things, everything from personal to more societal wide, that have impacted our ability to do a lot of things in our life. And
absolutely.
Emotions.
So one of our colleagues, Amelia Rubenstein, who's at the SAFE Center, uses kind of a general definition that I really like, and I told her I steal it, but I do credit her. It is an event or situation that overwhelms your capacity to cope. Right? Because there are things that can happen. You can witness an accident, you can suffer from depression, but that extra piece, the ability of that event, for whatever reason, to overwhelm your capacity to cope with it, that's when we head from upsetting, terrible event to traumatic event. So an event that overwhelms your capacity to cope. Now, when we think about, the obvious examples of what causes trauma: exposure to violence, physical abuse, like our participant said, sexual assault, accidents, natural disasters. But if we think a little bit broader, does anyone have any, Heather kind of hinted to this, that there are those individual traumatic events like right here, but there are also systemic or larger events. Can anyone think of some of those events? So not necessarily the thing that happens to you individually. Any guesses on that? Disintegration. Not quite sure what that means. I think I'm being a little too literal about disintegration. I'm like when you literally disintegrate, is that what happened? So what I'm talking about is discrimination. Maybe that's what Layla meant to type, but discrimination based on internal characteristics. So things like racism, like misogyny, like homophobia, like transphobia. Unfortunately, I think that there have been a number of attempts, or a lot of attempts, to kind of bring down the seriousness of those experiences, when instead I think we need to be hyping them up in terms of their ability to cause trauma. Experiences of racism are traumatic. Living in or in proximity to poverty. I just did a presentation last week on urban trauma, and so a presentation entirely on what living in or in proximity to poverty can feel like to individuals. And systemic neglect or betrayal. So I like to give an example of one of my first clients when I transitioned from social work to law. This individual was born to a mother struggling with substance use, who had her own history of trauma. They were in and out of homeless shelters throughout my client's childhood. She was removed early on from her mother's care due to abuse in the home, cycled in and out of, I think, like 6 or 8 foster homes where there was physical and sexual abuse throughout. She was trading sex for survival on the street by her early teenage years, cycling in and out of the juvenile legal system. And then as soon as she turned the magic age of 18, she was cycling in and out of the criminal legal system, and struggled with addiction herself. And I use her as an example because every single system that was put in place, designed in theory to help her, failed, and failed miserably. And it's really important, especially with, in terms of the work we do with trafficking survivors, or people put at high risk. They have been betrayed or neglected by numerous systems. And that really factors heavily into someone's ability to trust those systems. like us, right? And so recognizing that that systemic neglect or betrayal can cause trauma is really crucial. And so this includes, like I said, exposure to attorneys, to law enforcement, to social workers, to other social service staff. I say this not to tell you that you are causing trauma. I say this because you need to know that you can.
Mm-hmm.
That's crucial. So some common reactions to trauma: shock, anger, nervousness, fear, guilt, anxiety, inability to concentrate. Those are all really typical responses to trauma. These symptoms typically reduce over time. And then clinically speaking, not that, we do this presentation to train anyone to be a social worker, but it's good for you to know that if those really normal, typical symptoms don't reduce around 1 month after the traumatic event, this may indicate the development of something called post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Again, we're not going to go too far into this, but I do want to highlight 4 things, 4 common symptoms of PTSD that you might see when you're working with a client who has experienced trauma. The first is at the bottom right-hand side, somatization. And typically throughout this presentation, I use myself as an example. Whenever I get nervous or stressed out, my stomach starts to hurt. And I don't have, it's not anything that is diagnosable in terms of a medical problem. But what happens is my brain takes its psychic concern, its anxiety, its worry, and it funnels it out into the body, right? To kind of rid the brain of those symptoms. It expresses itself through bodily symptoms. So folks who have experienced a number of traumatic events, we'll talk briefly about complex trauma in a few slides, you can pretty much expect that individuals are going to express a lot of physical ailments, and that may be a manifestation of trauma, and it's important to think about that. I want to compare and contrast the difference between hypervigilance in the middle and hypoarousal on the upper left side. Hypervigilance is kind of what you would typically think of in terms of a traumatic response. So like TV, Law and Order trauma response. So individuals who are startled easily, who are crying, whose mood is cycling, who can't sit still, who are upset, kind of those more easily seen and recognized and noticed symptoms of trauma. Contrast that with hypoarousal, which is actually the opposite. It's where the body shuts down its traumatic responses because it can't take any more, right? And what that looks like is somebody who is under responsive to trauma. So someone who, and again, the example I always use is who's talking to you about an event that you would expect them to express some hypervigilant responses to, some upset. They're talking to you about it like they're telling you what kind of toppings they want on their pizza, right? There is the lack of response. And for individuals, this is universal. Obviously, we come from an expertise of working with survivors of trafficking, which is a type of trauma, but these are universal. And so for anyone who is working with someone in the legal system, right? A survivor of sexual assault, a survivor of trafficking, a survivor of childhood abuse, or a criminal defendant, right? Who is not showing any emotion or any affect or any, kind of typical affect when talking about an upsetting experience, which one do you think is going to be more believable to the finders of fact, to a judge, to a jury, to a prosecutor, right? It's going to be the person who showcases hypervigilance, who highlights, kind of what we typically think how someone should behave when they have been traumatized. And so it's really important that you, as a service provider in whatever field you're in, understand the difference between these two and can help interpret someone's behavior, right? Because if we're seeing someone who is not behaving with the affect that you would typically expect, having experienced a trafficking history, that doesn't mean that someone's not telling the truth. That doesn't mean that someone's not been traumatized. What it usually means is that there's been so much going on that the body and the brain have blocked that out, blocked out their ability to react. The last thing I want to highlight is on the bottom, self-medication through alcohol and drug use. You're going to rarely hear Heather and I ever say, addicted people who are addicted, struggling with addiction. We're going to talk about self-medication, people who are coping with histories of trauma through alcohol and drug use. And there is a reason that we have an alcohol and drug use problem in this country, and that is simply because it works. Now, it comes with a lot of side effects, right? There are legal side effects, there are interpersonal side effects or consequences, there are health consequences to alcohol and drug use. But in that moment of needing to quell those feelings of unpredictability or fear or anxiety or anger, alcohol and drug use works. And sometimes it can be a big breakthrough in working with a survivor of trauma if you start to talk about that in that way, and talk about, someone who has, struggled with, what we would call addiction for their whole lives, and reflect, wow, you've told me all about what has happened to you, the struggle, the traumatic events that you've experienced. And despite all of that, you went out and found a way to cope every single day with what has happened to you. That shows real strength and resilience. And that may be very confusing to someone who has only been judged for their substance use. But talking about it as self-medication, I think, is crucial for all of us to be doing in our work, even outside of our client work, so that finders of fact and people in power start to understand it that way too.
Just before we go to the next slide, I just wanted to comment too that
why is this not working? Sorry.
It's okay. It's also important to realize as well that you're likely not going to just see one of these things manifest and then be permanent. Like a lot of times people are going to cycle through different types of responses at different points. And they might be kind of bouncing back and forth between things, or they might have just one type of response. But I don't want people to think that, this is kind of the be all end all. If you see someone acting one way at a certain time, it's just part of their processing of everything. If they're reacting in different ways at different points in their life and in their, dealing with their experience, and even in working with an attorney or an advocate, it can often be, I feel like a lot of my clients, as we develop a closer relationship, I get to see kind of different responses to trauma, where before they might have been tightly controlled just to, for their own safety and
to manage the interaction with you. Yeah, exactly. Heather hits on a really key point, which is that the responses to trauma, a person's responses to trauma can change by the hour, by the day, by the situation. And the other thing to remember is they are not within our control. Mm-hmm. Right? So it may be frustrating to a person that they are responding in a certain way, or frustrating to you. There is no response, or no control over that necessarily. Mm-hmm. And so that cyclical behavior is trauma. It's just that simple. So we've been talking a lot about post-traumatic stress disorder, right? But what's crucial to think about is, what if there is nothing post about someone's post-traumatic stress disorder, right? Heather, the phrase in and of itself, post-traumatic, trauma exists, we are past it, and we're having a reaction.
This compartmentalization of even the label is problematic, because most of the clients, if you're working with someone who's been exploited, who's been abused, who suffered from some kind of systemic trauma, it's usually ongoing and often building. And so it's
compounding,
compounding, and it's something difficult to deal with.
So instead of PTSD, what you might be looking at is something called complex trauma. And I am very thankful for the term complex trauma, because when I was doing this work in the early 2000s, we didn't call it complex trauma. We called it disorders of extreme stress not otherwise specified.
Terrible name.
Which is a mouthful. So I'm very happy for the short phrase complex trauma. So trauma occurs, the best way to think of this is that trauma occurs along a continuum from singular to chronic. So again, I'll use myself. Right before the pandemic began, I lost my mom. And that was absolutely a traumatic event for me, because it did overwhelm my capacity to cope. That being said, I was, I had a roof over my head. I had the support of friends and family. I had a steady, stable job that earned me income. I had heat in the winter, air conditioning in the summer. I'm relatively mentally stable. So contrast that singular traumatic event, even bleeding into the pandemic, with the client that I described before. right? There's two very different experiences. And that is the continuum that I'm speaking of, where someone like me was showing symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. The trauma had happened, it ended, I had a reaction, right? Versus someone who is navigating chronic trauma throughout the course of their lives. That's going to produce very different symptoms, an increase in symptoms, both in number and severity, as well as in type. And some symptoms of common symptoms, of complex trauma. One that I think usually kind of perks ears up for people that listen to this presentation is the inability to regulate emotions or individuals who have self-destructive impulses. And the way I described it is, have you ever worked with someone or had an experience in your own life with someone who cannot get out of their own way? Like, if there's a pothole, you can put signs up, you can put a fence up, you can put barbed wire, they will still find a way to fall into the pothole. And that can be really frustrating, right? You know, someone who you're watching blow up their own life. And sometimes the assumptions we make about that person's willingness to do that, where we need to start to shift our thought process and say, whoa, that is a very easily understandable symptom of complex trauma, right? That inability to regulate emotions, those emotions that go all over, all over the planet, people who are self-destructive, and the consequences of that, those are very much symptoms of complex trauma. Individuals who have amnesia or memory loss, and Heather's going to cover that in a couple slides, or through to full-on dissociation, where it's actually pretty amazing that if the brain is completely overwhelmed by chronic trauma, essentially your brain will shut you off from reality and either take you to another place or essentially just ensure that you are not presently experiencing the trauma that's happening to you. Chronic guilt, intense shame, trauma bonding, for anyone who knows what Stockholm Syndrome is. That's essentially what trauma bonding is. It is I think it is something to be respected. It is a survival instinct. And essentially it is the recognition that my survival is in the hands of another person, right? If that person wants me dead, I will be dead, right? Or if that person wants to harm me, they will harm me. And so what I will do is switch my association with them to partner with them so that they stay happy, so that they stay comfortable, so that they stay okay with me, so that I stay alive. And I think that that's what we covered, a ton in the early days of helping people understand about trafficking, as well as domestic violence, when that movement really began in earnest in the 70s and 80s, is helping service providers understand why someone doesn't just skip right up to their service provider and say, thank you for helping me. This has been terrible. I'm really glad that you're here to take me away from this person. Where instead, there's a fight to get away from the person. There is, a want and a willingness to go back to that person, to protect that person, to not want to turn on that person. And we have to respect that is a survival instinct that has been learned. And it is not easy to just switch off. Trauma bonding takes time, or eliminating the bonds of trauma takes time, takes space, takes trust. A lot of what you will do if you follow some of the steps that we're going to be talking about in later slides. Intense difficulties with trust and intimacy. And again, those attempts at self-medication, right? Not addiction. These are people who are coping through the use of substances. So I'm going to turn it over to Heather to talk about trauma, or the impact of trauma on memory.
And this is really critical, as we, as attorneys, as advocates, are working with clients, because as we're trying to build their legal case, your client's memory, your client's recollection of events, and their ability to help you organize the data that they're sharing with you is really, the core of a lot of the legal work that we're doing. So when trauma is impacting your client's memory, it can make it more challenging to piece things together, but it can be done. There just are techniques that we would encourage you to pursue, and also just to encourage you to not get frustrated if it's a little harder than when you're working with a client who has not experienced trauma. So looking at, discussing trauma and memory a little bit more, trauma can actually physically damage parts of the brain. And it can damage the hippocampus, which is the area of the brain that's responsible for memory storage and retrieval. And this means that traumatized brains are simply not processing or storing memories in the same way as a non-traumatized brain would. And you can actually see it's kind of embedded in this slide, but there's a brain on the left-hand side. I'm ambidextrous and I was in my right and left.
Brain one of those people who still has to do this and be like, oh, left.
Oh my goodness. So on the left-hand side, you can see a brain that in the areas that are circled has a lot of color, there's highlights, there's activities, where embedded under the text of the slide, there's a picture of another brain. And that one in the same circled areas does not have as much activity, doesn't have the bright colors, it's darker. And that's showing the actual physical damage to the structure of the brain itself. And this is a huge challenge for us because, again, especially in the legal profession, being able to have your client tell an accurate, consistent, linear story. And
from beginning, linear means beginning to end.
Yeah, and
start at the beginning, end at the end.
Basing that on the memories that they're sharing with you, it's really a hallmark of believability when we go in front of a judge, when we're talking to a prosecutor, when we're even ourselves on initial meetings with clients, listening to their story and deciding, having our own internal reactions as to their believability and trustworthiness.
And I would take it back, actually, Heather, even to whether or not a case is going to be filed.
Yes, definitely. If you can't, if a client can't share the information that you need with you right away, it can even go back to the intake process. You know what I mean? Someone might be struggling to organize and share information because of the effect of trauma on their brain and the overall effect, particularly of complex trauma. And so this is why I think in our profession particularly, we give clients a lot of opportunities and chances to tell us things. And we work sometimes on building relationships and gathering information before we make decisions.
Yeah. And Layla asks, I guess why, actually, I don't know if it's possible, but for those of you who are sharing, if you could share to everyone, because your thoughts and questions can help other people. So Layla says, I guess why extreme events in our lives can sometimes cause temporary amnesia. Yeah, that's absolutely the case. And not just temporary amnesia, like not remembering ever. A little activity sometimes, if I have more time, I like to do, not really actually do, but do more with. Think about watching this presentation only with a thing of Post-its, right? And you're going to take all your notes on this thing, these Post-its. And so you're only going to have to be able to fit a little bit on each Post-it, right? And then you're going to line them up on your desk in the order that's going to help you tell me what you learned during this presentation, right? And then you're going to leave. I am going to screw up your order. I'm going to put Post-its on your door, on your ceiling, on your chair, and then I'm going to have you come back in 2 years and tell me everything that happened from beginning to end. It's
really hard,
simply impossible. And that is what happens in a person's memory when trauma is impacting the formation, storage, and retrieval of memories.
All right, so here's a few, we're going to dive deeper into best practice tips in the second half of this, but we wanted to just throw a few in here around dealing with the impact that trauma has on memory. And, we've covered a lot of these, but they're really worth reiterating. Just remember from the get-go that individuals you're meeting, survivors of trauma, may not be telling their story in a linear way. And please, please do not let that happening cause you to doubt their veracity, doubt their ability to be able to work with you to build a legal case. Because again, it is part of the biological response that their brain is having to their experiences. Remember that despite some memories perhaps being misfiled, like not lining up the way that they should, the actual recall of the memories that the individual is sharing with you is accurate to them. So that's something that's also really important. That, again, can bring up questions of trust and truthfulness, but if you're working with a survivor of trauma, you need to remember that they're doing the best they can to sort through what's happened in their brain and in their recollection of events. We always advise whenever you can to use orienting dates and events to help organize memories. We'll go into more depth about this and the tools you can use, but it's very helpful if you can roadmap as much as you can for a client and do it before you meet with them, based on things that you're able to gather about their case, supporting documents, things like that.
Yeah. And also just some orienting dates and events. Like what I do is I'll ask, was this before or after the birth of your first child?
Mhm.
Was this before or after your divorce? Was it warm outside or was it cold? Was it around your birthday or around your anniversary? You know, things that are that really do typically get imprinted in people's brains, that can help you sort things out.
Or if they've lived in different locations, trying to associate things with different addresses, different places. I've even I had a client once who, it was the orientation of a room she was staying that helped her remember, like,
Really?
what interactions were going on with what people. Yeah, that this.
You mean she remembered where she was in the room?
She remembered the room being set up a certain way,
Oh.
and that helped her recall certain events because she couldn't remember what city she was in or like exactly who she was with otherwise at the time. Like, so it was.
But that piece was what imprinted in her.
What triggered in her
Interesting.
memory. Yep. So you can be as creative as you want, but again, just helping the client to giving them as much data as you can to help them pick through their memories is really useful. And if conflicting info is presented, do highlight the need to sort through it as helping to organize the narrative, and be sure that you don't imply that you think that they're lying. And one thing I like to do with clients sometimes is when I'm initially getting information about them, about an incident, about their life experiences, I won't even write it down in a linear fashion. I'll almost make a spokes on a wheel, like webs, and just jot down pieces of information. So they see I'm not even expecting it to be linear. We're just trying to get bits of information down, and then we can sort through it later, try to assign a timeline to it later. But it's a way to take the pressure off the client and show visually that you're just at the gathering information stage.
Yeah, I like that. And I also don't hesitate to kind of go head on at some of that conflicting information. It's just how you do it. Like, if I'm hearing one day that, this happened, at this age, and then the next day I'm hearing something else happen, I'll say, when you were here before that, you told me that you went into foster care at age 8, but just now you told me that you didn't go in till age 16. So just help me understand kind of what was going on during that time. And you can also use, and this is a tip that we'll talk about more later, you can actually use the information that you now know about trauma and memory and say, I understand that this was a long time ago and that a lot was going on in your life. So I'm not surprised that you're telling me, 2 different stories about this, but let's try to figure it out together. Right? That is not intimating that someone's lying. It's actually using what you're learning about trauma and memory to help them normalize the fact that I was given 2 very different stories.
No, that's absolutely critical.
Okay. Does anyone who's listening have any other kind of best practice tips, things that you do to assist clients with memory and organizing memories? We're getting anything.
Well, if you think of things, we'd be happy for people to drop them in the chat. And again, as we move forward to the second part of this presentation, where we're talking specifically about techniques, please feel free to chime in with what's worked for you, what you've heard of, any questions you may have.
Great.
So we've talked a little bit about this, but just to touch again, there are some common client reactions to trauma that you may see when you are initially interviewing a client or working with them to develop an affidavit, to get down dates and series of events that matter for their legal case or for a petition you have to file. Again, and this is where, before we get into this list, it is so important to connect with your networks and to make sure that a client has some mental health support. I like to try to do that from the very beginning, but as we can see, as we're looking at these client reactions, it's good to have a plan in place before you even dive into things with the client. So there might be a return of or increase in active mental health systems. Things that the client was dealing with before may crop up again and manifest in a different way. There might be a flat or labile effect where someone just really has no emotional response. You might encounter times where your client is really emotional, hostile, or angry with you that you're even asking for information. And that can be a time to take a pause and a step back.
And Heather, I just want to go back to the affect, that flat affect, definitely, but the labile affect, I call it the roller coaster affect.
Oh, excuse me. Yes, yes, yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
up
yes.
and down, with no necessarily any warning. And that's a very different experience from someone who is just flat, right? And you can see both, and you can see both within the same interview.
Yes, yeah. And I feel like we have, like, again, it's, especially in the beginning when you're still establishing and building trust with your client. You might see a client who's avoiding appointments, court dates, and again, there can be a lot of reasons for this. This could be due to fear. This could be due to just struggling with remembering these dates and these events. And so it's good to explore that with the client. And again, at the HTPP, we give our clients lots of chances to work with us. We never, really shut the door because we understand the way that trauma has impacted both their memories, their brains, and the way that they're interacting with all of these systems we're asking them to now interact with as part of building a legal case. They might be forgetful of important details or dates. You might be seeing negative behavior directed towards attorneys, social service providers, towards yourself. And that can, of course, be challenging. But again, sometimes it's because the client is beginning to view you as kind of a safe space where they can act out, or it might just be a way for them to cope with all of the emotional turmoil that they're dealing with and the re-traumatization of having to revisit these events, tell their story.
Or their legitimate experiences of systemic neglect and betrayal.
Exactly.
Or a combination of all those things.
All those things, yeah. We often see, significant distrust of law enforcement, attorneys, other social service providers, and when clients also begin to normalize their trauma and their experiences of exploitation. I've had clients who have been incredulous to me when I've asked if they've called the police or if they've taken steps to report or to get help with a certain situation they've described, because they're like, why would I do that?
Why?
This was a daily occurrence. Like, what are you talking about? So again, just being ready and not being startled by or put off by these types of responses.
Yeah. And actually the normalization of trauma and exploitation, one of the ways, including just having zero faith in anything going their way. A lot of times you'll hear clients who talk about not caring what happened to them in their childhood, for instance, because they didn't expect to live past age 21. And that is actually a diagnosable symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder. It's called sense of a foreshortened future. And it is the legitimate belief that your life is going to end a lot sooner than is typical. So if you hear someone say something like that, in addition to the example that Heather raised, that is your antenna should go right up. That is someone who is expressing trauma to you.
And you might hear that even when frustrations arise, or if there is any conflict or difficult moments during your representation of a client. And again, that's where it's very important to try to have mental health professionals that you can turn to or the client's already connected with to support them through these experiences. So there are definitely some common reactions that people have to those who've experienced trauma. So thank you.
You're like, press the button, Jess.
Individuals that is okay. Individuals are often labeled treatment resistant or difficult. People might assume that they're being truthful or that they're at risk of potentially reoffending because of the manner they're presenting in, the way they're speaking, the way they're perhaps ignoring or avoiding certain things. We do see that individuals who've experienced trauma often get harsher punishments, longer sentences from the court system. And that's something that we all as advocates and attorneys need to be constantly educating the courts and the legal system about. And often people are really just seen only as a collection of symptoms rather than as a person who has had these all encapsulating experiences that have impacted every part of their life. So it's important to try to shift our worldview, shift our person view with the people that we're working with.
Yeah. And like Heather stated, there is data that indicates that there are harsher punishments and sentences that attach to criminal defendants who have experienced trauma. And I mean, it makes perfect sense, right? Because if a judge or a jury wants to see remorse for something that has been done, right? And this person may feel that, but can't express it because their ability to cope with any kind of adverse symptoms of trauma may have been shut out or shut down a long time ago. And so they physically can't muster up what you would want to see in terms of remorse. That is going to convince oftentimes, a finder of fact, like a judge or a jury, that you have no remorse. And so again, understanding how trauma actually manifests itself is really crucial to you as an advocate.
All right, so the second half of this presentation, we'll be doing a deeper dive into strategies for trauma-informed interviewing. So these PowerPoint animations, always a fun time.
Always an adventure.
So first, I mean, we, again, in our field, we talk about, and I feel like everyone throws around the term that they are trauma informed. It's almost a catchphrase now that any service provider has to include in their description of their services. But what really matters is what you actually do.
Are you actually trauma informed?
Are you actually trauma informed? And we have a few definitions we're going to share, and then we'll give you some tips and techniques and advice for how to really maximize this in your practice. So again, being a trauma informed, it really means what happened to her, him, or them versus what is wrong with a person. You just take away those assumptions. You take away the judgment, and you just try to learn from your client and be open to all of the experiences they are having and be ready to provide support. Trauma informed care is really grounded in empathy, in being a responsible advocate, in restraining from judgment. Those are all critical points if you want to try to have a truly trauma-informed practice. And being trauma-informed also means that you have to understand that clients might be engaging in some self-destructive behaviors like self-injury, substance use, aggression, missing things, the chronic inaction that can be sometimes very frustrating for attorneys and advocates. Those might just be their ways of coping with past trauma, as opposed to character flaws or active decisions to avoid doing the things that they're supposed to do.
Right.
So
and that goes back to what you talked about at the beginning. Instead of character flaw, that means what's wrong with them. And instead, let's ask what happened to develop that behavior. Right. And we see that so often, excuse versus explanation, especially when we talk about or talk to, prosecutors and law enforcement. There's always kind of the assumption that we're going to say, like, nobody is responsible for anything. And that's not what we're saying, right? We're not excusing people's behavior necessarily, but imagine what type of a system we would have if we focused on explaining it.
Yeah, no, and I see there's a question in here about how do you handle clients who are facing severe trauma but refuse to speak up because of their immigration status? That's a difficult question. In our practice, we are often working with individuals who don't have stable immigration status after they've already become connected with some type of service provider or support. I think the answer is really to build up as much of a support network as you can for that individual, to look into whether and how they need to speak up, or if they don't, in order to access certain types of benefits. We don't practice immigration law here, but the visas that are available for individuals who've experienced trauma, whether it's under the Violence Against Women Act, the T visa, the U visa, there are exceptions that can be made to individuals having to work with law enforcement due to trauma. There are ways of showing an individual's experiences, documenting their experiences without them having to have reported to the police or to other types of authorities. So that's where, again, getting a experienced and skilled immigration practitioner, getting other types of attorneys if you need it, getting a great mental health professional, trying to build up a network for your client and a circle of support for your client where they can get these questions answered and not be pushed to do things that would make them unsafe.
Right. And I think it really goes back to starting at the beginning. It's understanding that that person is having a perfectly normal response to an abnormal situation, which is capped off by another abnormal situation, which is they're concerned about being deported, right? And I think that service providers, I think one of the mistakes service providers make is that they believe that their clients have to do certain things, right? That person doesn't have to necessarily speak up, right? That person may, decide that they don't want to report what has happened to them, even if you want them to. And the hallmark of working with someone who's experienced trauma is to restore as much control in their lives as you possibly can. And control sometimes means making the decision to do something that you don't want them to do. Right. And that is really hard as a service provider who's like, no, but I'm trauma informed and you can trust me. This may not be the time in that person's life when they're able to do that. And I think Heather hits the nail on the head by providing, or at least attempting to provide, as much insulation as possible so that that person maybe does start to trust, or at least the seed is planted. And they don't necessarily trust you or trust your program, but they will remember the kindness that they experienced the next time they try.
And Layla shared a great story in the chat. Thank you for sharing that, Layla. And I'll also add, just jumping off of that, I have a lot of experience with immigration work myself in my past, prior to working with the Human Trafficking Prevention Project. And, a lot of times things take time. A lot of times, I think attorneys and advocates feel that a client maybe should pursue some type of remedy, whether it's immigration relief or something, or report something in the best interest of themselves and their community, but that is just not clients' feelings or view at the time. And we need to be able to just present options, provide supports, and then let go. And let the client make a decision that's best for them. And that may mean they withdraw, they don't pursue something. And that's why we always try to leave the door open. I have a lot of clients who I've worked with on things. Maybe we've accomplished a chunk of a case, or we've begun laying out, their story to build up an affidavit, and they need to take a break and take a step back, and that's fine. You know what I mean? Of course, you need to manage your case flow. It can get complicated,
of course.
But figuring these things out is also kind of a hallmark of being trauma informed, not feeling like you have to push through things to get a certain kind of benefit that you and your wisdom as the attorney or advocate have determined is in the best interest of the client. That's not what we do when we're performing and engaging in trauma informed cases. All right, so here's some practical tips. Actually, before you meet with a client that you may know has experienced trauma, maybe it's from a referral you got background on the information on the client. Oftentimes we're doing criminal record relief focused work at the HTPP, and we see the prior to meeting with the client, the interactions the client has had with the criminal justice system. So we like to always be prepared, even before we actually meet with a client. And you'll see a lot of these tips and tricks kind of go back to all the issues we were talking about, how people are struggling with memory. They're perhaps struggling to engage, to make it to that appointment. So we want to do everything we can to make it as easy as possible and to make the client feel as supported as possible from the get-go. So if you're going to be interviewing a client or meeting with them, please, please, please ensure the client has all the information they need to get to the space where you're meeting in an efficient and hopefully informed way. Make sure they're capable of traveling to the space. Do they need money? Do they have mobility issues? Do they have childcare or need help with childcare? You brainstorm that with them. Is it safe for them to be traveling? These are all things that you may not know until you ask, could be preventing a client from meeting with you or causing a last minute cancellation.
And I think when we make those assumptions, right, we're just like, here's the address. See you tomorrow, right? There may be some embarrassment over not having the money to travel, or not having childcare, or not knowing if I can bring my kids, so then I'm just not going to go. Not even thinking through safety issues. So when we make those assumptions that someone's just going to get to us, we really are kind of highlighting that we are not thinking through these issues as a partner with them. And so perhaps we are not the safest person for them to engage with. So this stuff is really, really crucial. And it's stuff that sometimes, when people are first starting this work, I used to have the work that I do here at UB used to be a clinic. And this would always be the first question that I'd ask the student attorneys. What's the first thing you're going to ask or tell your client? And it would always be the address. And I'd be like, but how do you even know they can get here? And they'd be like, oh.
And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have solutions for all these issues too, but checking in with the client, you can brainstorm, you can potentially come up with options, or just they feel comfortable sharing if maybe there's a barrier that would prevent them from being able to meet with you at a particular place, and then you can figure out another option. So if an individual is able to come to the office, make sure they have directions. I always like to send a letter or an email or something prior to a meeting, a text, whatever means of communication you have, so that they know a way to contact you. They have a minute beforehand to figure out how to get there. Be sure you ask if they need help figuring out how to get to the location you're meeting, if they need parking options, if they are taking public transit or walking, are there routes that you can suggest? That's just, again, showing care and concern and being helpful from the get-go.
Yeah.
One thing, like at MVLS, we are on the 14th floor of an office building in downtown
So glad you
Baltimore.
brought this up.
Yeah, and
thank you.
Clients often would not realize what's going to happen when they even enter the building. You have to go through glass doors and you have to check in with security. So you have to sign in, give your name, which can be incredibly intimidating for somebody who has experienced trauma, or just for anybody. And then you have to be able to say what organization you're going to, what floor you need to go to. So being sure your client's aware that that experience is going to happen and that they're ready for that is huge. Or if that might be a hurdle for the client, going down and meeting them in the lobby is also another answer. Just try to accommodate as much as you can.
Yeah. And for those of you who are in buildings where, UB is a little bit different. I've been to Heather's building. It actually isn't more intimidating than you think, because I always forget the floor and I'm always like, where am I going? It is the time for you to be proactive and speak to front desk staff about how they speak to clients, right? And let them know these are individuals who might not be able to produce an identification document, who might be anxious. If you have, transgender clients coming in, making sure that there's no misgendering going on. These are all things that you can be proactive about in preparing for a client meeting or interview.
Yeah, you basically think about what interactions the client's going to have coming to you, and then try to take steps to mitigate any risk of further traumatization. All right. We also really advise preparing the space you're going to meet in. Think about the room setup. I know this is a little strange now with COVID and people's practices and work. We're doing a lot more over Zoom. You might be, only meeting clients in a very limited capacity. At MVLS, we've just begun to open our office up a little bit more to the visitors. But think about the space where you're meeting. If it's in your office, is that going to be comfortable for the client? Is it going to feel too confined? Is there a conference room that might be available that would offer a little bit more open space? How is the room set up? Is the client able to sit close to a door? Are they being put in a corner away from an exit or entrance in a way that might make them feel hemmed in and a little bit apprehensive? Provide the client with as much information and documents as you can. This is something that I'm constantly striving to improve with my practice. Sometimes it's like, oh my gosh, we're all working on a bunch of cases. We're in the middle of a frazzled time and you're trying to prepare everything for your client. Make sure you have extra copies for them. Make sure you have, if you're going over something, make sure that they can take a version of that home if they need to look at it more closely, if it's hard to focus during that meeting. Make sure that you have supplies for the client, a notepad, pen, sticky notes, something for them to do. Jess is showing off her fidget bowl.
That's what I call it.
I have something
Just
similar in my office as well, where clients can, I actually put out colored pens and a notepad a lot of the time. A lot of my clients will sketch while they're talking to me. And it's just a way for them to physically do something while they're dealing with discussing what are often very, traumatic details, traumatic memories, revisiting traumatic experiences. So we really strongly urge fidget bowls, coloring, like whatever tactile option you can give to let the client let out some stress while you're meeting. And some people may not want this at all. That's also perfectly fine, but just having it as an option is a great thing. And also, it's important as you're preparing the space to look around, see if there's anything that might be triggering, or, it's funny, we were listening to a national call yesterday talking about trauma-informed practices with with OVC, Office of Victims of Crimes, and other trafficking, anti-trafficking programs around the country. And, even something like your art on the wall, like this is a greater discussion, but you want to think about what images the client's encountering, what are they seeing? Again, is it better to meet in your office or to meet in a more neutral space? These are all things that you can think about if you want to set up a welcoming environment. When a client arrives, I always think this is really important too, is to check in about basic needs. You don't know how long that person may have been traveling, what they may have had to do to get there, if they had any interruptions or things happen on the way. I always ask, do you need to use the restroom? Let me show you where it is. Would you like some water? Is there anything else I can get for you? Again, just to make them as comfortable as possible and to take the onus off the client to have to request these things when they may already be intimidated by just coming to the office.
And it is really crucial to remember and understand how much thirst and hunger can affect people's ability to function, right? If somebody is, struggling with food insecurity, they are not going to be able to think and remember and communicate in quite the same way that they would if they were satiated. So to the extent that you can have snacks available, and you don't want to make assumptions about which clients need this and which don't. Like Heather said, some people might have no use for the fidget bowl, but you just do it because the client might need it. That is really crucial.
And again, we realize that, COVID can make these things complicated right now, but it's just something to keep in your mind for future practice and to accommodate whenever you can. And then, small talk too. Instead of launching into, your attorney.
How old were you when you were abused?
We can't emphasize enough just having a little bit of small talk, letting the person see that you're human. I mean, I'm a notorious nervous joke maker, and Jess is too. So I try to find something to maybe laugh about or just whatever it takes.
The three easiest things: weather, parking / transportation, or sports. Launch into any of those three topics, you'll have something to talk about, even if it's how somebody hates sports. Those are the three winners for me.
All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about triggers and what happens if somebody is triggered when you are meeting with them, and how to adjust and respond to help to help in a number of ways. First, try to prevent triggers. Second, to cope with them if they occur, and then kind of follow up responses. So what is a trigger? You can see we have a few images here. I kind of show the breadth of what may possibly be triggering somebody. And a trigger is something that can cause somebody to revisit or go back to a traumatic experience and have the same physiological response that they had during that traumatic experience or some other type of trauma response. So there's a lot of things that can be triggers. It might be a smell, it might be a particular sound, it might be seeing a type of person, it might be, seeing somebody's even expressions, how someone is looking at them, words or phrases that are used can be triggered and can bring somebody back to a particular traumatic memory, experiencing certain feelings, pretty much anything. Unfortunately.
Hashtag all the things.
Yeah, can be a trigger. And so when someone's experienced trauma, it's just good to know that this can happen, and you may have no warning, you may have no idea what's caused it, but there are ways to, again, kind of hopefully prevent and then to mitigate and hopefully successfully respond and be supportive if somebody gets triggered.
And it's interesting when people are doing interviews to try to help people remember or to put together, you know, a timeline of an event, a traumatic event, a lot of people skip asking, what did you smell? And you shouldn't, because it's actually our strongest sense memory is our olfactory sense, believe it or not. So asking what the person smelled is probably going to net more information than you actually think it would. All right, so we're going to talk, as Heather said, we talked about what triggers are. Let's talk about ways to anticipate or mitigate triggers. Okay, so Heather hinted to some of this before as a way to prep beforehand, but what we did in kind of setting it up this way is to help you understand that by doing those things that Heather described, you are actually anticipating for triggers happening or trying to mitigate the existence of triggers. So offering options in the physical space, like Heather said, thinking about the room, thinking about what's on display, thinking about whether a round table is more welcoming than a square table that might resemble a prosecutor's office, right? And the number one thing, just want to reiterate it and really drive it home, make sure that your client can access the door. Make sure that your client can get out of the room, right? That's typically what I do is I ask a client to sit where they're comfortable, and then I sit away from the door to make sure that even if they're not necessarily cognizant of it, I want them to know they can always get out if they need to. You're also going to want to be sensitive to the number and gender identity or presentation of the people in the room. The former, nobody likes to feel like a lab rat, right? So this might not be the time to have 4 interns with you. Now, it might be the time to have 1 intern with you so that if you go to the last piece, being considerate with note-taking, it's very hard to kind of engage with someone if someone's face is in their computer or their notepad. So having someone who is, you know, under the umbrella of confidentiality, taking notes so you can lead the session, that's fantastic. But nobody wants to feel like they're in a petri dish. The other thing that you have to consider is if you are working with someone who has experienced interpersonal violence, right? They may be triggered by the gender identity or presentation of someone in the room. Now, the reality of our work is that our clients are overwhelmingly female identified and their perpetrators are overwhelmingly male identified or presenting. Now, does that mean that a male identified or presenting person can't be a strong attorney or other type of service provider? Absolutely not. But they do need to be aware of the fact that just their presence may be triggering to someone. And so can you have a female associate or an intern in the room? Can you be more delicate even about your placement or about the placement of your body or about the movements that you make, right? That is going to be a concern that maybe I am not going to have to necessarily consider if my client is female identified or presenting and their perpetrator was not, right? Offer comforting things in the room. Heather talked about this: note paper, pad, the fidget bowl. It is so much easier for people. Tissues, don't ever forget tissues, sorry. It is very much easier for someone to talk to you about something traumatic while they're staring at this squishy ball instead of staring you dead in the eye, right? It just makes life a little bit easier. You're going to want to explain things in advance. We've said this many times, one of the hallmarks of a traumatic experience is loss of control. And so inviting or bringing some predictability into the equation is something that is really going to soothe anxiety. And so a roadmap can be something like, we've got about an hour to speak today. I'd like to revisit or start back where we ended at our, during our last session, where we started to talk about how you met your trafficker. After we get through a little bit on that, I'd like to go over some forms with you and make some copies. And then I'd like to hear about your, you mentioned that you went to the doctor the other day, and I'd like an update on that. I don't know, whatever it is. And so what that does is it lends predictability to the encounter so that the person knows what is going to happen next. That really eliminates or relieves a lot of anxiety that someone may have in an already anxious situation with you. the next piece I think is crucial, and Heather hinted to it earlier, clarify someone's support system availability. This is proactive support, right? So when you first start meeting with someone, have the conversation about when you get upset or stressed, what do you do? Who do you go to? Is there anyone that you like talking to that makes you feel better? So that you are armed with that information and you can say, you know, today feels like it was a rough session here with me. I know that you tend to call your sister when you're stressed out. Can you swing by her house on the way home, or can you call her on your way home? If I know that my client is in active mental health treatment, I may schedule a session on a Wednesday when I know on Thursday morning they're going to go meet with their therapist. Right? It's also having those resources at your fingertips, knowing where to refer someone if they are struggling with housing instability. They're not going to be able to talk to you if they don't know where their next meal is going to come from, right? So having those resources at your fingertips, and also not freaking out if your client says that they cope in a way that concerns you. I mean, I've had clients who are just like, I get high. And you know what? Instead of going, oh my God, please don't do that. We talk about ways to get high that are safer. Where do you get your product? How do you test your product? Right? Can you use with someone else? Can we plan on you not driving or getting behind the wheel? And really not freaking out about that, because right now, that is how your client copes. And recognizing it, going back to the beginning of this presentation, recognizing it as and respecting it as a coping mechanism instead of something that someone's doing that makes them, you know, a degenerate in some way. That's really, really crucial.
And if you're uncomfortable having these conversations, like there are resources all around that can help with this too. We have an amazing Maryland harm reduction community in the state that has a great network. There's also, you know, they're based here in Baltimore. So there are lots of resources that are available, other community organizations, outreach programs, healthcare providers that can offer some support if your client needs it. If you learn that they're doing coping mechanisms that you may be uncomfortable talking about.
Right. They can train you on how to talk about reducing harm. That's Baltimore Harm Reduction Coalition. They are excellent. We like them a lot. You're going to also want to offer breaks. Now, the question of whose responsibility it is, it's both of yours, right? It's yours and the client. I typically don't go more than 30 or 45 minutes without asking about a break, but I may do it earlier if the person looks like, and this is a judgment call, person looks like they need a break, doesn't mean they have to take one, right? And making that clear ahead of time, just saying, you know, we're going to break after a period of time regardless. But if you feel like you need a break in the interim, or if I feel like you might need one as well, I might suggest one. And then it's also really important to remember that, like, your client isn't sharing these traumatic experiences with an empty room. They're sharing them with you. And so you may have a reaction and need a break. And so the easiest way to get out of the room, everybody has to pee. Right? That's my I'm so sorry. I need a break. I have to use the restroom. What that does is give me 10 minutes to go into the bathroom, get my proverbial SHIT together, and come back to the client with being a little bit more clear-headed. Layla, we're gonna record. We are recording, so you can get the rest of it. We are definitely probably gonna go up to about 1:30, which is what we anticipated. You already said that.
All over it. Yeah. And I was just going to hop on Jess's comments about breaks. I mean, again, a lot of things are judgment calls, right? You got to feel out the situation, how things are going as you're interviewing or talking with the client. But, there's nothing wrong with proactively taking a break yourself. Like, and I do that very often. I also have kind of a 30-minute rule. If we haven't paused for a second, often I will couch it as I need to do this to meet my needs, whether it's grab a drink of water, use the restroom, and then it gives it individual opportunity to do that, or to just sit, you know what I mean? Whatever they want to do or feel comfortable.
Yeah, shoot the small talk.
And, we're talking a lot of this advice is couched in terms of in-person meetings. But please, 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 as we are all continuing to work in this virtual and often phone-based world, don't forget about this when you are talking to somebody on the phone. Because I think sometimes I forget, and it's an important thing to remember.
I do too.
So it's something that we can all improve on. And again, try to keep those rules that you would have in person also when you're dealing with someone virtually or telephonically.
Yeah. Using open body language, it's really just about recognizing your place in the room, and locking up your body language with crossed legs and crossed arms, or with a look on your face that is unpleasant, perhaps, is something that is going to be transmitted to the client. So you just want to have open body language, open shoulders, open eyes, making sure that you're making eye contact, listening. And being considerate with note taking. Like we said, if you have to do an interview by yourself, you just want to say, I'm going to be pausing so that I can take notes, just so that they know, because unfortunately, especially with individuals who have had a lot of experience in the mental health field, there may unfortunately be, they may have unfortunately experienced individuals who are just writing notes the entire time.
Yeah. And I try to explain this too, again, thinking about doing things telephonically or on a video. If I'm taking notes on my computer, or, even intake, during intake, putting in information the client's getting me into our online forms and database, I'll tell them, I'm like, there's going to be a pause for a second because I got to catch up putting this information in, so the client doesn't think you've just stopped speaking with them or they forgot to provide something. But it can be very awkward. And again, all of these points of advice are just trying to smooth that interaction with the client and make it as welcoming and comforting as possible.
And predictable.
Yes. And I got to tell you one thing with open body language. Oh my gosh, I had a client once, and I forget who they were talking to, but it was someone, I think it was someone in law enforcement. And they had an interview with this individual prior to meeting with me. And then when they came to me, they couldn't stop talking about how the person they were talking to, their foot was going the whole time. Like their foot, almost bouncing. And my client was just like, oh my gosh, I felt like they were so impatient. Like I felt like I needed to hurry up everything. And I got so scared, and then I couldn't remember what I had to share with them or the details. And it was funny. It was just from someone having their legs crossed and their foot going incessantly.
And it might have just been a nervous tick that meant
it could have been a nervous tick from the other person. Exactly. But it was just interesting and tough, for me to then talk to my client, try to kind of bring them down and make them see that, this could have had nothing to do with you, but it really impacted their ability to tell the story.
One of the things, one of my former student attorneys turned me on to the big clock on my cell phone. If I'm in a place where there's not necessarily a clock on the wall, instead of checking my phone, which might be disconcerting to a client, I'll put the clock on my phone and have it up so that we can all see the time. And then that way I'm not checking my phone all the time to make sure we're going over the time that we are, supposed to be at. All right, so you can do all the things to make sure that your client is feeling as comfortable as possible, and they're probably still going to experience some sort of triggering response to what you're discussing, okay? And so what do you do to respond to triggers in the moment? One of the first things that we want you to do is notice and validate the survivor's feelings, and you can do this in two different ways. There's something called active listening, and we're going to talk about passive listening. Within the realm of active listening, you can do something called mirroring the client statements, which is where you reflect back both the content and the feeling, the content of what the client just shared with you, and the feelings expressed within that content, right? So someone's telling me all these things, and then I say, wow, so after your landlord evicted you, sounds like you felt scared thinking about your family's future, right? So I'm reflecting that they talked about the eviction, and then I'm reflecting the feelings of fear that I believe that individual expressed. And if that's, something you're not necessarily comfortable with, just breaking down those feelings and labeling them. It sounds like that experience was really scary, really painful, really stressful for you. Now, if you're wrong, that's okay, because that gives you and the client the opportunity to communicate about what the client was actually feeling. So if I said you felt scared thinking about your family's future, the client could be like, no, I was pissed. Okay, well, tell me about that. right? There's still, it brings up, or it introduces options to clarify someone's feelings. One of the ways that you can actually train yourself to do something like this is that you have someone that you know take 1 minute at the end of their day to tell you something that happened to them that was upsetting or meaningful in some way. And then you practice mirroring those the statements back to them, and just do that a couple of times until it, you get the feeling. For me, it's second nature because I've been doing it for so long. But it really is just a way that you can train yourself, right? Have your kid tell you what happened during lunch.
I was just going to say, I use this technique on my children all the time. Or children. And yeah, they, just to be sure I'm understanding what they want to communicate with me. And this isn't to, infantilize any clients or anything like that. It's just, sometimes I use it with my partner. Like, it's just a way to show you're being a responsive listener.
Yep, exactly.
And it's a way for you to not be saying anything on top of or in addition to what they're saying, just to show that you have heard them. Right. And that's powerful, whether it's in a client attorney relationship or other types of relationships in your life.
Right. And Heather, you said at the beginning, like or a couple slides ago, all that we're teaching right now is inherent in any ethical, responsive, respectful, healthy relationship. Like, this is not rocket science. It really isn't. Another thing, if you're uncomfortable with the active listening, or if the client's really going, you want to make sure you're highlighting your passive listening skills. In the story that Layla typed to us, she highlighted some of the passive listening skills. So your body language, that open body language, your eye contact, your verbal cues, your 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 those kind of things. I'm a big fan of the dog head tilt. Like,
I'm a nodder.
I'm a big fan of that.
I'm a nodder.
I'm a nodder and a head tilter. That's more because I'm deaf in one ear and I'm always tilting my ear to be able to hear the person better. But it really looks like I care, even though I'm really just trying to be able to make sure I can hear the person. But those passive listening skills can do a lot for you.
And it can be something simple, like, sometimes I'll just, if someone's been, talking for a while, it's like, thank you for sharing that. And, I'm catching up, or like, just again, just even just that moment where you're showing that you're paying attention, you're interested, you're happy to be working with them. It's huge.
Yeah. And now, as a result of, this training, and hopefully maybe if you want to go back and listen to our more in-depth Trauma 101 presentation, you can provide basic psychoeducation on trauma responses. And one of the most powerful things that was taught to me in my social work days was the phrase, "You are having a perfectly normal response to an abnormal event." Trauma responses make people feel like they are going crazy. They are not. They are having a perfectly normal response to something that's happened to them that was very abnormal, right? And like I said during the memory slides, just telling someone, remember how I do this all the time with clients as I'm kind of working through timelines. I always say, remember how we talked about memory and how memory fades with time, and that storage and retrieval is impacted by that, as well as, experiences with trauma. So, if you can't remember this, can't remember a lot about this, I completely understand, right? Or someone who says, I feel, I'm just so sick of this. I feel angry all the time. And when I'm not crying, I'm pissed off and I can't get control of my emotions. Guess what? You can say, that is a perfectly normal response to what you're going through right now. And tell them, you don't have a lot of control over it, which is even more upsetting. But you need to know that how you are behaving is normal. It is so powerful.
I use a variation of this phrase. I mean, it is probably one of the most frequent things that I say to clients that I work with, particularly if you're diving in deep on a case, like if you're working on a vacatur petition, if you're, working on something where you have to get, more details about a client's story. It is just such a powerful thing. I advise people to write it down, put it on a sticky note, and put it on your computer screen, like your wall. So you have it ready to use.
Yeah. Yeah, it's incredibly powerful. You're also going to want to be very purposeful in how you ask questions. You're going to want to use open-ended questions to get as much information or to encourage as much dialogue as possible. Who, what, where, when, and how. You see that we've crossed off the word why, okay? That's because why questions can feel kind of blamey, right? Like, why did you take that route home the other night when you were sexually assaulted? Why didn't you leave? Why didn't you tell someone?
Why didn't you call the police?
Yeah, right? Why questions can sound really, really blamey. That being said, if you need to ask a why question, and just generally speaking, you're going to want to provide context. So a lot of times questions that you may really need to ask trauma survivors can feel accusatory, because if, you know, in our work, for instance, if I'm preparing a vacatur petition, I'm going to want to think about all of the crap that can be thrown at this story, right? And about substance use and about sexual behavior. And so I may need to ask some questions to kind of clarify some of those things. But questions and topics that are typically used to blame people for what's happened to them, like their sexual behavior, like their drug use, you're going to want to provide some introductory information before asking so that you can help the survivor to understand the purpose behind your question. So I'll say something like, because I'm going to want to ask about drug use, right? But I don't want to intimate in asking about drug use that I am saying they deserved what happened to them, or that their drug use was the reason that these things happened, right? So I'll say things like, you know, it's really common for individuals who have struggled with traumatic events in their lives to want to feel a little bit better, right? And one of the things that folks do a lot of times is use drugs and alcohol. Has that ever happened to you? Or has that ever been a way that you have coped with what you've just described to me? And then I can ask a why question. Why do you think you started using, right? So because I'm not being like, why did you start using? I'm asking why in the context of something that I've already normalized. Or I'm also not going to dive right into questions about sexual abuse, you know, with a client. So during your childhood, were you ever sexually abused? I'm not going to say that. I'm going to say something like, one of the things that we hear a lot from our clients who have had experiences like yours, who have survived a trafficking experience, unfortunately, is that they experienced sexual abuse when they were younger. Has that ever happened to you?
Right?
Right?
And I mean, if you're a pro bono attorney, if you're someone who isn't working regularly with traumatized individuals, this can seem challenging, right? You might be like, I don't have the context to like create these kinds of questions. But that's where what you're doing here today, just educating yourselves about these issues, any reading you can do about the issues the survivor might be grappling with can help you. Again, the key word that Jess used is you're normalizing the situation. You're making the individual feel like their experience isn't something horrific and outstanding. It's something that they went through, they were doing to cope. This has happened to others, and we have some solutions. Exactly.
Right. And it is hard because you have to think before you think. You have to prep for what you're going to say and say it out loud. But again, if you have just a little elevator speech for some of the things that are most common, sexual abuse, what we would, you know, promiscuous behavior as a youngster, you know, running away or behavioral challenges, substance use. If you have a little elevator speech for those things, you're going to be way ahead of the game. Again, responding to people being triggered, you're going to ask what would help. You're going to say, would you like to take it? You know, and it looks like you're feeling some things right now. Would you want to take a moment to yourself? Do you want to take a bathroom break? Do you want to visit with your sister in the waiting room? And by doing that, you are acknowledging implicitly your client is the expert on what is going to help them. Right? Offer a variety of things to them. And then if things progress and folks can very easily become non-communicative or uncommunicative when they are just so kind of infiltrated mentally with triggers and feelings and sensations and anger and fear and all of those things, what you are going to want to do, if they're not necessarily in a place where they can tell you what would help them, you are going to want to interrupt that automated nervous system response. You're going to want to help them get grounded in the present. You're going to want to get them out of here and into this moment, back into this moment. And what you typically what you just need to do is interrupt the cycle, right? And so you can say, I like your shoes. Are they comfortable? That requires someone to look down, look at their shoes, and communicate with you. Sometimes that's all that you need when the bus is moving, but no one's behind the wheel. Someone to interrupt that cycle. You can simply sit there and say, we can sit here in this space as long as we need to. We're okay here, we're safe here, right? And just let the person feel and let them know that you are there with them. You can say, is it hard for you to focus on these questions? Some people say that just taking a minute to notice yourself breathing is helpful. That's really key, because when your client goes into fight, flight, freeze, or appease mode, right? They're having a trauma response. What happens is your brain shuts off your more conscious and rational portions of the brain, and it just focuses on making sure that those pieces that you need to survive are functioning. And one of the things that we typically do when we are nervous and scared is we start to breathe more in a more shallow manner, right? That is just the reality of how our bodies react to stress and trauma. And so helping them get back in tune with their breathing, doing a breathing exercise where you breathe in for 4, hold it for 4, out for 4. You are interrupting those very normal but very uncontrollable responses to trauma. And then you know what? You know what? Sometimes all of that will fail.
And sometimes you just need to pause or stop.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
What I do, and I call it, I made this up, I call it sitting with the suck. Sometimes all you can do is sit with someone and reflect the reality that this sucks. I can't tell you how meaningful and transformative it can be to just sit and be present with someone else's pain. You're not solving it. You're not making it better. You have no solutions. All you have is the recognition that this sucks. And we're going to sit here and we're going to breathe, and that's okay. So some do's and don'ts working with survivors. Do we want to, you want to kind of start that out, and we can
Sure. And yeah, we're
these in our last couple of slides.
Yep, we're wrapping these up. We have just a few more minutes worth of material for you all. So please, the takeaways for today, understand that trauma is manifesting itself in many different ways and in different ways for different kinds of people. And there's no right way to be a victim or to experience or re-experience trauma.
And if anything, the belief that there is why so many individuals are denied access to justice, because they don't behave like the right kind of victim. Exactly.
Please remember that there are structural forms of oppression. We've talked about this, experiencing poverty, living in, proximity to poverty, experiencing racism, transphobia, other things that can be just as traumatizing as an individual's a single traumatic event or a series of traumatic events or experience they had being exploited. So you have to look at the whole picture and not just single things out. Please remember the traumatic experience that you as an attorney or an advocate are focused on, what you need to establish and show and detail out to prove and make your legal case may not be the most painful thing that the individual you're working with has experienced. So again, just refraining from that judgment, refraining from making assumptions, it's huge.
Just kind of to think, just an example of that, you're right, where when you make that assumption, you are putting your lens on something. I can't tell you how many clients from 20 years ago through now, where, you know what, the sexual abuse they experienced was not the most upsetting thing. Not being believed was.
Yeah, I see that all the time with clients too, where
so not making those assumptions
are often sometimes more traumatized by the systems that failed to help them than by the exploitation or abuse they experienced. And so again, don't project your worldview on the individuals that you're
Right.
You need to remain open-minded and be as supportive as you can. Please, please, please pay close attention to the phrasing of your questions. Give space for people to think and to respond. Explain yourself as much as you can in order to increase comfort. And of course, this is kind of, sometimes people are like, this is in contrast to everything you've been telling us, but do as much as you can, try to maintain healthy boundaries, right? We've been talking to you a lot about trauma. We've been talking to you a lot about mental health issues, but most of the people on this call, the volunteers at MVLS, we're not mental health professionals, right? We're attorneys, we're advocates, we're working in providing housing, we're tons of different roles. Maintain your boundaries, stay in your lane of expertise, but know where to go to get resources and know how to offer support to kind of bridge that for people.
So some don'ts. The first one I call the clutching your pearls reaction. Don't have an overly visible reaction to the information your client shares. Now, it doesn't mean you don't want to respond to things that are awful, but you don't want to be like, because when you show, horror at what the client is expressing, or you get upset, a couple of things shift. First of all, sometimes the client will start taking care of you because you've shown that you need caretaking. It can also very much color a trauma survivor's willingness to continue to share with you, because they may learn, like, this person cannot handle this, so I'm going to sugarcoat this stuff so that I don't necessarily have to traumatize this person anymore. Or this person is so out of touch with the reality of what is going on the ground with people like me that I'm done.
And that's a huge hurdle. I mean, just as we are power holders with, our credentials, with our status of being attorneys, of being advocates, of being licensed professionals, like, you have to be conscious of that and how it can damage or prevent the formation of a constructive relationship.
You don't want to ask any questions that you don't have a legal or otherwise basis for. One of the easiest things that I can think of always is for instance, when I'm working with a transgender client, right? Now, I'm going to want to ask about their experiences, coming out as transgender or transitioning, because I'm going to want to help the finder of fact potentially understand why that person was put at highest risk. But I don't have to ask about whether or not they got the surgery, all of those things that, you may be curious about, but that don't factor into the legal or service issue that you are working to help them with. You don't need to ask about it because it can come off as creepy. It can come off as sensationalized, and the person can really feel uncomfortable. So you only want to focus your questions on what you need to do, what you need to understand to do your job. You obviously don't want to label the survivor in any way or pathologize their experiences. So for instance, I never tell someone, you are a human trafficking survivor. I will say something like, the experiences that you just described meet the legal definition of a crime called human trafficking. And as a result, X, Y, and Z, you have this legal option if we're talking about, clearing someone's criminal record. Whether or not they choose to incorporate that into their lives in any way, that's up to the client. It's not up to me. And kind of in that same vein, you don't want to assume that the trauma survivor views the perpetrator of the offense against them negatively, or that the survivor's traumatic experience was entirely negative. This is huge in interpersonal violence. So trafficking, domestic violence, child sexual abuse, child physical abuse. Again, going back to what Heather talked about in the third bullet, we don't want to use our own experiences and our own assumptions to color or to become our clients' experiences. I mean, I can remember working with two things. I remember one of the first things that happened to me when I was in social work school was that I was working with kids who, were in residential treatment facilities. And in my mind, I was like, I would never want to go back to that house where this thing happened. right? But the kids helped me understand that they did want to go back. They just wanted the abuse to stop, right? And so had I made that assumption that there's no way that kid wanted to go home, I would have really interrupted the understanding and the learning that I was doing and the bonding that I was doing with that young person. The other thing is I remember a young person, trafficking survivor, I think 13 or 14, who arrived with us where I was working back in New York, and she had been beaten up by her trafficker. And it was pretty awful, and she was very upset. But you know, she also remembered that after her trafficker beat her up, he went out and bought her favorite 50-cent soda and bag of chips. And so like that was a positive thing. And if I had made him into a monster as a result of that one experience, I would have lost the complexity of human relationships. Human beings are complex, relationships are complicated. And when we make these blanket black and white assumptions about those experiences, again, we lose that ability to bond with and understand our client. We don't want to behave or use language in a way that reinforces the survivor shame. We covered that a few slides ago. And throughout, we've talked about, you know, why survivors of trauma may have difficulties maintaining contact or keeping appointments. Those things are all typical and expectable. Not going to go through this. This PowerPoint is going to be posted on MVLS's HT website. But I like it because I think it's good for any of us who are doing this work to print out and maybe again put up in your, you know, near your computer or in your cubicle, because it kind of highlights ways that people can say things that are not trauma informed and how they can become trauma informed just by a different turn of phrase, essentially. The last thing we're going to talk about today is vicarious trauma. We could do a whole thing, and maybe we actually need to do a whole thing on this.
Yeah, we should.
But vicarious trauma is about you. So this stems from exposure to pain, fear, and trauma of others. It is different from burnout, when you are just overwhelmed by the number of cases that you have and the number of different directions you're being pulled in. This is the experience of listening to other people's trauma on you as the service provider. And the symptoms may mirror those of traumatized clients: exhaustion, anger, irritability, impacted interpersonal relationships, job performance suffering, avoiding work with traumatized clients. When things get worse, personal values and beliefs may be impacted by apathy, detachment, or hopelessness. And then someone's worldview and sense of purpose in their lives or in their jobs can be compromised. I don't want to say that it'll ever get this bad, and it won't if you are aware of it and if you are vigilant, but this will happen to you, right? It's not a matter of if, it is when. And so if you choose to work in this world and work with clients who have experienced trauma, you have to have a plan. And it is very easy. I am speaking as someone who recently did this, where I was coping in a very unhealthy way, and I didn't use the tools in my tool belt, right? The things that I know, that I train on all the time. So you need to have a plan for how you're going to deal with things. If you start to notice changes in your personality, or someone notes that to you, you start to know changes in your substance use, in your sleep patterns, in your eating patterns. You have to notice those things, and you have to have a plan for what to do if those things happen. And then you actually have to do the thing. That's the piece that I forgot when I was struggling after my mom passed away.
And Jess and I are here, and there's a whole community of advocates here, you know, in Maryland and around the country that are able to provide support. There's lots of great trainings and information on this. I think, you know, many of us doing just nonprofit work, regardless of what your area
Hell yes.
is, many of us will experience this, encounter this in our lives. And it is something that through support, you know, you can overcome, but it's important to be aware of it, because otherwise it can affect you and you aren't even, you know, understanding the changes that are happening because of that vicarious exposure.
And so the last thing we want to leave you is a quote that I think sums up kind of all that we've said throughout this hour and a half. Traumatic experiences shake the foundations of our beliefs about safety and shatter our assumptions of trust. Because they are so far outside what we would expect, these events provoke reactions that feel strange and crazy. Even though these reactions are unusual and disturbing, they are typical and expectable. By and large, these are normal responses to abnormal events.
And as we said about the sticky notes, you can print out that entire slide
Oh,
and
yes,
just hang it in
fabulous.
your office. And we've underlined the part of this that, you know, we really hope you carry with you, that, you know, we laud all of you for your interest in working with individuals who have experienced trauma. It is a challenging thing to do, but you are really supporting and helping someone. And we hope we've given you some tools to be able to be more confident in building those relationships, enabling clients to open up, work with you together collaboratively on developing legal cases, or, you know, meeting whatever other needs they may have. We thank you so much for joining us today for this event and for this discussion. Please do visit our website, www.mvlslaw.org/HT, where we have a library of, oh my goodness, so many webinars that we have done now over the last
All the
3 years.
webinars.
As well as information about our program and services, and an easy portal to use to make referrals for individuals who might be interested in getting help through the HTPP. We also have a lot of outreach materials. We're happy to send a care package to you, your organization, your law firm, your church, your community center, your school. We'll send it out. So just reach out to me at the email address below, or at my personal email address. Please also follow us on social media. MVLS has a regularly updated calendar of great trainings and events that you can participate in, as well as highlighting things put on by the Human Trafficking Prevention Project and other projects within our umbrella organization. And yeah, thank you so much. It was a long presentation. We hope you learned a lot. We are here to answer any questions. For any follow-up, please feel free to reach out to either Jess or myself. And we so appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks, everybody. Oh, thank you, Susan.
Yay.
We're grateful you were here. And again, the slides will be available online, so you don't have to, so you'll actually be able to have them with you.
I always email out, you should be getting in the next week or 2, once we get everything up on our website, you will be getting a PDF of the slides, as well as a link to the recording on our website. So keep an eye out for that, and please contact us if you have any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.